Welcome, dear friends, to a story that might just change the way you see family, truth, and the power of one's will. Today, we delve into the life of a young man named Ethan, who's lived his entire life under the shadow of a father's cold and unforgiving hand. But what if everything he's ever known was built on a lie? What if the truth, once uncovered, could either destroy him or set him free? Ethan's journey is one of discovery, betrayal, and ultimately, the fight for his own identity. As we unfold this tale, you'll find yourself questioning the very foundations of trust and the meaning of justice. So sit back, relax, and get ready for a story that promises to keep you on the edge of your seat. The story begins now. Enjoy. The first rays of dawn barely kissed the horizon when Ethan was jolted awake by the familiar, stern voice of Victor. "Up, boy! The fields won't tend themselves," his father barked, the usual lack of warmth in his tone. Ethan dragged himself out of bed, muscles aching from the previous day's toil. The routine was as predictable as the sunrise, another day of back-breaking work with no end in sight. Yet today, something gnawed at Ethan, a question that had lingered in his mind for years. As he and Victor walked silently to the barn, Ethan finally mustered the courage to speak. "Why do you treat me like this, Pa? Like I'm nothing but a servant?" The words hung in the air, heavier than the morning mist. Victor stopped in his tracks, turning to face Ethan with a cold glare that could freeze fire. "Do your work, Ethan. You're not here to question me," he snapped before walking off, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and a growing sense of resentment. Later that day, while tending to the fields, Ethan spotted Sarah walking toward him, her familiar gentle smile a stark contrast to the harshness of his father's demeanor. "Morning, Ethan," she greeted, handing him a small basket of fresh bread. "You look like you could use a break." Ethan took the basket gratefully, but the burden of unanswered questions weighed heavily on him. "Sarah, do you know why he treats me like this?" he asked, his voice tinged with the desperation of a man on the edge. Sarah hesitated, her eyes betraying a sadness she quickly masked. "Your father. He has his reasons, Ethan. But sometimes, what we endure isn't about who we are, but about what others are afraid to face." With that, she gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder and walked away, leaving Ethan more confused than before. That night, as Ethan sought refuge in the dusty, dimly lit basement, his thoughts churned restlessly. It was there, while moving some old crates, that his hand brushed against something odd, a wooden box hidden behind a stack of forgotten tools. Curious, he pulled it out and carefully opened the lid. Inside, he found a stack of letters, yellowed with age. One in particular caught his eye. The letter was addressed to Victor, but it was what he read inside that made his heart pound in his chest. It spoke of a child, a boy, who was not Victor's son, a boy who was taken in under a veil of secrecy, for reasons unknown. Ethan's hands trembled as he realized the implications. This letter. It was about him. The man he'd called Pa all his life might not be his father after all. Ethan barely slept that night. The revelation from the letter gnawed at him, refusing to let his mind rest. When the first light of dawn broke, he was already on his feet, determined to confront Victor. The usual weight of the day's chores now felt insignificant compared to the burden of uncertainty. At breakfast, the tension was palpable. Victor, oblivious to Ethan's turmoil, ate in silence. Finally, Ethan couldn't take it any longer. "Pa, we need to talk," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Victor's eyes narrowed as he looked up from his plate. "About what?" he asked, suspicion lacing his tone. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then pulled the crumpled letter from his pocket, placing it on the table between them. "I found this last night. What does it mean, Pa? Who am I?" Victor's face hardened as he snatched the letter from the table, his knuckles white with tension. He read the words quickly, his expression growing darker with every line. Without warning, he crumpled the letter in his fist and threw it into the fireplace, the flames eagerly consuming it. "You shouldn't have gone snooping around, boy," Victor growled, his voice cold as steel. "That letter is nothing but old lies. Forget you ever saw it." "But," Ethan began, only to be cut off by Victor's icy glare. "Forget it," Victor repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And if I catch you digging into the past again, you'll regret it." With that, Victor stormed out of the room, leaving Ethan standing there, torn between fear and anger. But as the last of the letter's ashes faded away in the fireplace, Ethan knew there was no turning back. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it would not be easily uprooted. Desperate for answers, Ethan turned to the one person he trusted, Sarah. He found her in her small kitchen later that afternoon, the smell of fresh bread filling the air. "Sarah, I need to know the truth," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I found a letter. It said I'm not Victor's son." Sarah froze, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the loaf of bread she was kneading. "Ethan, this isn't something you should be digging into," she said softly, her eyes avoiding his. "Please, Sarah." "I need to know who I am," Ethan pleaded, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Sarah sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping in resignation. "I don't know everything, Ethan," she began cautiously, "but there are things about your past, things Victor has kept hidden for a reason. He's always been afraid that the truth would come out, afraid of what it might do to you." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "What truth? What is he hiding from me?" Sarah shook her head, clearly torn. "I can't say more, Ethan. But know this, you're stronger than you think. Whatever you find out, you can handle it." With that cryptic warning, Sarah turned back to her work, leaving Ethan with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear, he couldn't stop now. He had to keep digging, no matter what Victor or anyone else said. Determined, Ethan spent the next few days discreetly asking questions around town, speaking to the older residents who had known his family for years. Most were tight-lipped, but a few let slip just enough to fuel his suspicions further. Whispers of a man who had once been close to his mother, of a tragedy that had struck years ago, and of secrets buried deep in the past. As Ethan pieced together the fragments of these conversations, a picture began to form, a picture that made him both anxious and resolute. He was getting closer to the truth, and he knew he would soon uncover the full story, no matter the cost. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy tension. Ethan kept his head down, going about his work as usual, but his mind was constantly racing. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that the life he thought he knew was built on secrets and lies. But with each new discovery came more questions, and his frustration grew with every passing day. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, Sarah appeared at the Walker home. Her expression was troubled, and she hesitated at the door before knocking. Ethan, already on edge, quickly answered. "Sarah, what's wrong?" he asked, concern lacing his voice. Sarah glanced around nervously, then stepped inside. "Ethan, I found something. Something I think you need to see," she whispered, pulling a small, weathered photograph from her pocket. She handed it to him, her hands shaking slightly. Ethan stared at the photo, his breath catching in his throat. It was an old picture of his mother, smiling warmly, her arm wrapped around a man Ethan didn't recognize. The man looked nothing like Victor. His features were softer, kinder, and there was a striking resemblance between him and Ethan. "Who is he?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah looked away, unable to meet his eyes. That man was very close to your mother. His name was James Collins. He came to Willow Creek not long before you were born. They were very much in love." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "And Victor? Where does he fit into all this?" "Victor. He and your mother were married, yes. But their relationship was complicated. When James came into the picture, everything changed. Victor was a proud man, Ethan. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her. Or you." Ethan's mind reeled. "So, James is my father." The words felt foreign on his tongue, as if he were speaking someone else's truth. Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes, Ethan. As far as I know, James is your real father. Victor, he knew, but he couldn't bring himself to let you go. He raised you as his own, out of a sense of duty, and perhaps out of fear of what the town would think." Ethan's world spun. The man he had called Pa, his entire life had built that relationship on a foundation of deception. Anger welled up inside him, but so did a deep, aching sadness. "Why didn't you tell me sooner, Sarah?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I wanted to, Ethan, believe me. But Victor, he threatened me. He said it was for your own good, that knowing the truth would only hurt you." I didn't know what else to do," Sarah replied, tears welling up in her eyes. Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions. "I need to find out more. I need to know everything," he said, his voice filled with determination. Later that night, after Sarah left, Ethan found himself drawn to the old, abandoned cabin on the outskirts of town, a place he had avoided for years. He had heard whispers about the cabin, that it was once a place where secrets were kept and deals were made. Now, it seemed like the perfect place to uncover the truth. With a flashlight in hand, Ethan carefully made his way through the overgrown path leading to the cabin. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the interior bathed in darkness and silence. Dust motes floated in the air, illuminated by the thin beam of light from his flashlight. Ethan searched the cabin, rifling through old papers and digging through forgotten drawers. Finally, in the back of a closet, he found a small, locked box. He pried it open with a rusty tool he found nearby, his hands trembling with anticipation. Inside were more letters, old photographs, and a small, leather-bound journal. He flipped through the journal, his eyes widening with every page. It was James's journal, detailing his love for Ethan's mother, their plans to leave Willow Creek, and the looming threat of Victor's wrath. The final entry was dated just days before Ethan's birth, and it hinted at a confrontation that never took place, because James had disappeared without a trace. Ethan's blood ran cold. He had always believed his mother had died in an accident shortly after his birth, but now he wasn't so sure. Had Victor done something to keep James away? Had he been the cause of his mother's death? Ethan knew one thing for certain. He was closer than ever to uncovering the truth, and nothing would stop him now. The discovery of James's journal had left Ethan reeling, his mind awash with questions that demanded answers. The truth was slipping through his fingers like sand, and he knew he had to act quickly before Victor caught wind of his investigation. The revelations from the journal painted a picture of love, betrayal, and a tragedy that had been kept hidden for far too long. Determined to dig deeper, Ethan sought out the few remaining elders in Willow Creek who might remember the events of 2 decades ago. He was particularly drawn to Old Man Carter, a recluse who had once been close friends with both Victor and James. Ethan found him sitting on his porch, puffing on an ancient pipe, his eyes clouded with the weight of years gone by. "Carter," Ethan began cautiously, "I need to know what happened between Victor and James all those years ago." The old man looked up, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized Ethan. "You're asking dangerous questions, boy. Some things are best left buried," he rasped, his voice rough with age. "I need to know the truth," Ethan insisted, his voice firm. "It's about my mother and James Collins." At the mention of James's name, Carter sighed deeply, setting down his pipe. "James was a good man, better than most in this town. But he was a fool for crossing Victor. Your mother, she was everything to both of them. When James came into the picture, it was like lighting a fuse." Ethan listened intently as Carter's voice dropped to a whisper. "They were going to run away together, your mother and James. But Victor, he found out. They had a confrontation, a big one. I heard them shouting that night. The next day, James was gone, and your mother, well, she was never the same." Ethan's stomach churned with a mix of anger and fear. What happened to James? Did Victor? Did he kill him? Carter shook his head slowly. "No one knows for sure. Some say Victor scared him off. Others think he did something worse. But there were rumors, whispers that Victor had a hand in it. After James disappeared, your mother fell into despair, and she died shortly after. Some say it was an accident, but I never believed that." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him as the pieces began to fall into place. His mother's tragic death, James's disappearance, and Victor's iron grip on him all made sense now. Victor had orchestrated everything, manipulating and controlling those around him to maintain his power and hide the truth. Fueled by the need for justice, Ethan returned to the cabin that night, determined to find more evidence of Victor's involvement in James's disappearance. He scoured the journal again, focusing on the final entries. There were mentions of a secret meeting, a confrontation at an old mill outside of town, a place that had long been abandoned. Ethan decided to go there, convinced that it held the key to unraveling the mystery. The mill was decrepit, its walls crumbling and covered in vines. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. As Ethan explored the dark corners of the mill, he stumbled upon a hidden compartment beneath the floor. With a sense of foreboding, he pried it open. Inside were items that sent chills down his spine: a blood-stained handkerchief, a silver locket that had belonged to his mother, and an old, rusted knife. There was also a letter, hastily written and never sent, from James to his mother. The letter revealed that he had planned to confront Victor one last time, to demand a life with her and their child. Ethan's heart raced as he realized the implications. Victor had likely been responsible for James's disappearance, and perhaps even his mother's death. The man who had raised him, who had treated him like a servant, was a monster hiding behind a mask of fatherly duty. But as the truth came into focus, Ethan also felt a gnawing uncertainty. Confronting Victor now could lead to violence, or worse. He was playing with fire, and the flames could consume everything he knew. Still, he couldn't turn back. He had come too far, and the truth, no matter how dark, had to come to light. Ethan left the mill that night with the evidence in hand, his resolve hardened. He would confront Victor with the truth, and this time there would be no more lies, no more running. It was time to end the cycle of deception once and for all. The tension in the Walker household was thicker than the summer air. Ethan had spent the last few days avoiding Victor, gathering his strength and preparing for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. The truth weighed heavily on his shoulders, but it was a burden he was ready to bear. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, Ethan decided it was time. He found Victor sitting in the dimly lit living room, the familiar scowl etched into his face. Victor looked up as Ethan entered, sensing the change in his son's demeanor. "We need to talk," Ethan said, his voice steady but laced with the urgency of someone who had nothing left to lose. Victor's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion crossing his features. "What is it now, boy?" he asked, his tone sharp. Ethan took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "I know everything, Victor. About my mother, about James, about you." Victor's expression hardened, his hands clenching the arms of his chair. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, though there was a hint of fear behind his words. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I found James's journal. I found the locket, the knife. I know you had something to do with his disappearance. And I know you were involved in my mother's death." For a moment, there was silence. Then, in a flash of anger, Victor rose to his feet, towering over Ethan. "You have no idea what you're saying," he growled, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Everything I did to protect you, to protect this family." "Protect me?" Ethan echoed, disbelief coloring his tone. "You kept me in the dark, treated me like a servant, and lied to me my whole life. How is that protecting me?" Victor's face twisted with emotion, a mixture of anger, guilt, and something else, regret. "You don't understand, Ethan. Your mother was going to leave, with that man. She was going to take you away from me. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't lose you." Ethan shook his head, his voice breaking. "You lost me the moment you chose control over love. The moment you decided that your pride was worth more than the truth." Victor's eyes softened, but only for a brief moment. "It wasn't just pride, Ethan. I was scared. Scared of losing everything. Scared of being alone. But I see now that I lost you anyway." Ethan felt a pang of sadness, but he knew he couldn't let that deter him. "It's too late for excuses, Victor. What you did to James, to my mother, it can't be undone. But what happens now is up to you." Victor stared at Ethan, the weight of his sins evident in his eyes. "What do you want from me, Ethan? An apology? Do you want me to pay for what I did?" Ethan hesitated, the words he had rehearsed so many times suddenly feeling inadequate. "I want the truth, Victor. I want you to admit what you did. And I want you to let me go. No more lies, no more control. Just let me live my life." Victor's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. For the first time, he looked truly defeated. "You're right," he said quietly. "I can't keep you here anymore. I've done enough damage." The room was silent as Victor sank back into his chair, his eyes staring at something far beyond the walls of the old house. "I did it, Ethan," he confessed, his voice hollow. "I confronted James that night. I told him to leave and never come back. We fought. He fell. I never meant for him to die, but he did. Your mother, she couldn't live with the guilt, and when she found out she was pregnant with you, it was too much. She took her own life." The words hung in the air like a curse, and Ethan felt the room close in around him. The truth was more devastating than he had imagined. But it was the truth, nonetheless. Ethan swallowed hard, fighting back tears. I need to go, Victor. I need to figure out who I am, away from all of this. But I hope you find peace someday. Victor nodded, his eyes wet with unshed tears.
I'm sorry, Ethan.
I'm so sorry. Ethan turned and walked out of the house, the weight of the past finally lifting from his shoulders. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he felt free. As he walked away from the only home he had ever known, the sky above him began to clear, the storm clouds giving way to a brighter horizon. And with each step, Ethan felt a new beginning unfold before him, a chance to rebuild, to discover, and to live a life on his own terms. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment with a number from 1 to 5 to let us know how much you like the story. Also watch the video that is currently on your screen. See you soon.